Europa, a cold, distant, seemingly lonely place, full of rumor, speculation, and mystery. Long has there been an interdict, a vanguard sanction against going there, but I'm sure you've heard it, the call. Whispers, rumors, and reports that something is amassing on Europa, and given the desperate need for power and information we have, with the pyramids in our system, the call is even louder. Welcome back, Guardians, to another Embrace Destiny video. Kaz PhD here, and today we are starting an analysis into the cold Jovian moon of Europa. As always, timestamps and description can be found below, if you want or need to jump to the information most relevant for you. This is intended to be the first in a series of videos preparing us to journey beyond light. Given how busy we all are with the evacuation of certain planets in our system, I have chosen to adopt a very straightforward production process for these reports. Time, not flash, is of the essence. Not long ago, I received a communique from none other than the Exos stranger. For any of you who are new, or whose paths have never crossed the strangers, she is a mysterious figure who always seems to show up at the most crucial time. We'll speak more of her later, but the short version is, if she is here, something big is happening. The first message I received was a redacted Vanguard report. In it, 13 sections discussing Europa and whether or not Guardians should be allowed to travel there. The report was written by Agent CHA-319, otherwise known as Chowko Yang, a hidden agent working closely with Ikora Rey, who our hunter and warlock friends may recall if they've ever inspected the lore inscribed within their Vesper of Radius or Dragon Shadow armor. In any case, the report begins with the original interdict on Europa, established by the Awoken. Prior to the Taken War, the Reef maintained an interdict upon the poorly navigable Jovian moons. The section goes on to say that, since the Taken War, and the near decimation of the Awoken fleet, the interdict has failed. Guardians have been exploring these moons at length, most notably Io in particular. However, as the agent reported, Europa still remains under interdict, but not by the Awoken, rather by the Vanguard. Next, the agent states that she has been asked to review this interdiction and its necessity. She notes that all files on Europa are heavily redacted, and that this alone would be enough to inspire most Guardians to go. We chase secrets, mysteries, and monsters for a living, after all. Section 3 describes the environment of Europa. First, the radiation, intense enough to, quote, mangle both flesh and machinery, end quote. Temperatures never more than 50 Kelvin at the poles, and no more than 110 Kelvin at the equator. The moon was never terraformed by the traveler, has no proper atmosphere, and features strong tidal stress due to Jupiter's intense gravity. However, as the agent puts it, risk of death alone cannot justify a no-landing edict. Guardians themselves are not immortal, but with their ghosts and their light, we are effectively so. Section 4 describes the subcrustal ocean. While Europa is only 0.02% the volume of Earth, most of that volume is ocean. Golden Age technology may have been able to traverse its depths, but that knowledge has been lost for some time. Sections 5 and 6 are where things become really interesting. In orbit around Europa, the agent found a Golden Age, heavily armed platform. It uses Hall effect or similar propulsion to maintain its orbit, and is still quite active, rapidly engaging against any vessel that comes too close. Curiously, ships of the Eon series are not as rapidly engaged, but all jump ships, being rare and valuable, are advised to keep their distance. Next, flybys have observed a Golden Age compound bearing Clovis Bray insignia. Surrounding it seems to be the carcasses of thousands of Vex. Stranger still, there appears to be no sign of major Vex construction, suggesting an invasion force rather than a colonization effort. In Section 7, the agent details her coordination with Paladin Kamala Rior of the Reef. Paladin Rior, who once made a request to the Guardians in the Tower to help aid the Reef, who was met with support from Zavala and the Vanguard, provided the agent with equipment to detect high physics measurements. Using this, the agent was able to detect incredibly high levels normally attributed to the Nine. As the Nine's influence seems to follow planetary masses, it is no surprise that levels would be high around Jupiter, but they seem higher still focused on Europa. The agent speculates about Xur's possible involvement, given the speculation that Xur himself is a Nine manifestation built on a Jovian colonist. In Section 8, the agent states there are no signs of Ahamkara, no signs of those reality-shaping magic wish dragons, as some are likely to call them. Section 9 is a perfect mixture of news bringing both light and darkness to me. Mithrax, aka Agent VIP number 3987, has relayed reports of a no-go area around the Golden Age station. While Europa has been a popular refueling site for the Fallen for some time, they have noted this taboo area as, quote, something that cannot be stolen from, end quote. These words bring the darkness I mentioned quite literally, as this language is similar to how the Elixni speak of the darkness. Section 10 continues the path to disturbing, reminding the Vanguard of the dreams many Exos face. Found in old journals and in the dark recesses of many Exo minds, memories of Jupiter in the sky and ice on the ground persist. Europa could be the origin of this phenomenon, but these nightmares appear as old as Exos themselves. Sections 11 and 12 feature the agent's doubts and trepidation concerning Europa. Her instruments cannot get a clear reading too close to the moon, and all of these observations bring a strong sense of foreboding. Finally, in Section 13, the agent suggests that Europa's interdiction be lifted. While dangerous and mysterious, the agent states that this should not stand in the way of knowledge and progress. We need to know what is happening on our very borders, especially if there appears to be greater dangers building within. However, a brief response from Warlock Vanguard Ikora Ray stated that the interdict will not be lifted due to, quote, compartmentalized information, end quote. Whatever the Vanguard knows is enough to warrant keeping the interdiction closed, for now. While a short report, there is a lot to unpack here. The universe is a dangerous place. Nothing new, nothing changed. Despite efforts by the Guardians, Field Scouts, civilian patrols, and our allies in the Reef and elsewhere, the system is full of dangers, both natural and driven by nefarious forces. However, Europa seems particularly dangerous. Environmental conditions worse than we have seen in a long time, far from the desolation we see on Luna or Io, for example, and surrounded by mystery after mystery. Why are energy readings associated with the Nine so high around this moon? What was Clovis Bray doing there, and how and why is the orbital platform so active? What is this fallen taboo, no-go zone? And what were the Vex doing there? Finally, what does the Vanguard know that neither you, I, nor Agent CHA-319 doesn't? I understand the need for compartmentalized information. The Vanguard, while seemingly static and maybe non-productive, are coordinating research, defense, and now evacuation of numerous strike teams, locations, and planets at once. However, the pyramids, as threatening as they loom, have not made a move, and our research over this season, working with Eris Morn, suggests a communication being established rather than an invasion. If that's the case, we should really try to learn more about what is going on in Europa. And as common as it may be to simply disregard the Vanguard, I think we need to convince them to work with us on this one. In any case, neither you nor I will be left waiting for answers for long, because the Vanguard report was not the only thing the Exo-Stranger left me. No, she also left me a decrypted copy of Clovis Bray's personal logs. And trust me, things only become more interesting from here. Clovis Bray. The man was everywhere, it seems. During your adventures, Guardians, between the gunfights and loot chests, you may have seen the name, the insignia, maybe even used the technology. But like the hierarchy of the Hive, the more you dig into Clovis Bray's history, the more you find. Even now, as reports arise concerning Europa, a rather recently unexplored moon of Jupiter, the name Clovis Bray has arisen. What was he doing there? What can we expect to find? Despite their age, the logs are well maintained, with both typescript and notes scrawled in between. Diagrams, blueprints, formulas, and coded images intersperse the 9 journal entries. Reading through is like a descent into madness, from a somewhat reasonable perspective to the truly obscure and, frankly, terrible. If it weren't someone's journals, it would simply read as well-written science fiction, following a scientist's fanatical search for immortality, taking him far beyond both our physical and philosophical limits. But, since these are supposedly the living logs of the famous, or rather infamous, Clovis Bray, the results, the journey, are even more foreboding. Suffice it to say, you've been warned. Entry 1. The Arrival. The first entry details Bray's arrival to Europa and establishes his research station. Traveling aboard the Hanu 2 spacecraft, Clovis Bray's official mission was to construct a long-term colony to study for indigenous life on Europa. However, Bray makes both his intention and personality very clear early on, calling the mission, quote, the most expensive lie in human history, end quote. While he does intend to map Europa's life, his main purpose on the moon was to seek the secret of immortality through a process he calls clarity. See, Clovis Bray was dying, and had been for some time. Arguably, many of the projects he so feverishly pursued, the technological marvels he created, were all in the pursuit of immortality. Sivatech, exoscience, experiments on the Vex, all of it, not for any altruistic benefits to humankind, but for his own survival, and the survival of his way of thinking. Important to note that this mission follows the discovery of the K1 artifact on Luna. We have not covered it in some time, Guardians, but prior to the events of Shadowkeep, Eris Morn entrusted us with a journal, similar to this, detailing the early research performed on the moon during the Golden Age. There, a team of scientists discovered an artifact, which they called K1, which seemed to act as a transceiver, with power and energy readings like the Traveler. Clovis Bray funded and supported the mission, but things went very wrong very quickly. The artifact had severe psychological effects on the researchers, from paranoia to visions, and eventually Bray actually covered the whole thing up. In fact, for those Crucible enthusiasts out there, the anomaly map is actually the site of the K1 artifact discovery, and the facility in the center is a Bray isolation chamber, preventing contact between it and the outside. Importantly, as the events of Shadowkeep unfolded, we learned that the artifact, the Seed, was apparently a way to connect with the darkness, to hear its messages, and Eris has been working on deciphering its messages ever since. According to Bray, the K1 artifact promised him a, quote, gateway to the secret of immortality, end quote, waiting on Europa. So, with his Hanu spacecraft carrying 8 habitats, 600 shielded robotic frames, backup replication chambers, hazardous environment engineers, and Eon-type platforms for radar, lidar, and deep ice monitoring, Bray set his course on the lonely Jovian moon. The entry concludes with both an examination of the dangers of the oceanic depths of Europa and Clovis's ongoing projects, including projects on the Exomind, Clarity, being a good man and grandfather, and becoming the Luca of future human thought. All of which were in process and will be discussed here later. In Entry 2, settled on Europa, Bray's frames begin construction of the station. External radiation was so bad the frames had to be reset and repaired often. Here, we learn a lot about Clovis Bray's motivation, his philosophy, and his goals. For those a little rusty in the study of metaphysics, we're going to take this one step at a time. First, to settle something that had proven confusing, Clovis Bray had a son, Clovis Bray Jr., or, as he is called here, Clovis II. We'll discuss the Bray family more fully, but it is important to point out, especially as distinctions and definitions are often difficult to come by in our pursuit of answers in the lore. Clovis Bray Sr. had a philosophy, a book entitled Competitive Immortality Through Primogeniture of Future Human Ontogeny, Raphanology, or PFHOR for short. And you thought debating with Asher Mir was a pain. Breaking it down, the text can be roughly simplified to competitive immortality through the study of the firstborn's life, death, and evolutionary development. Or, as Clovis II put it, most of our energy should be spent in support of the things that are most like us. Or, the best way to spend energy is on things that make more things like us. See, here, the firstborn is not the eldest son in a family, but rather the first ancestor in a long line. While ancestry and legacy have been very important to many families and movements throughout history, the Brays take it a step further. Essentially, they wish to maintain their own immortality, not only literally, but by ensuring that everyone who comes after them draws inspiration from the Bray family. As Clovis Sr. said, "Children are viron replicators of our ideas, but there is a certain terror about them. The terror is change. Clovis wants to live forever and have his thoughts, his intention and approach to life to not only live forever, but be the guiding approach by which the rest of humanity conducts itself." He wished to become the Luca, the last universal common ancestor of all human thought, and he was willing to do just about anything to achieve it. Clovis Sr. replaced his son's mitochondrial DNA, normally inherited from the mother, with his own, to make his son more like him, and he had been developing exotech to reach his earlier goal. Scrawled throughout this entry are discussions on the problem of exominds. At this stage, an exomind was not much more than an advanced frame. There were problems with the technology. People could not be transferred properly into a synthetic frame, and if it was attempted, a catastrophic process followed. When Clovis II became ill, Bray Sr. did everything he could to save him. Unfortunately, the body was failing, and Clovis attempted to save his mind. Unfortunately, at this time, the only way to achieve 100% fidelity, to make a perfect copy, was in a process which destroyed the original. A quantum snapshot, it was called. Ultimately left Clovis II's mind apparently perfectly copied, but unable to occupy a synthetic body, owing to exominds crashing and rejecting the exo frame. Bray believed he lacked the alkahest, the universal solvent which could fix this process and allow for the transformation. Finally, the entry details an encounter with actual Europan life. Described as a bristling thing, large as a whale, it appeared to have a central core and numerous tentacled limbs. These moved back and forth slowly, drawing its prey in both by its movement and the plankton which had built up on its exterior. If damaged or threatened, the life form would literally tear itself apart, limbs scattering everywhere to possibly recombine later. Bray absolutely despised the creature, but it is very interesting to hear more about Europan life. If we ever go, will we encounter creatures such as these? And what if it's prey? The Golden Age scientist and visionary Clovis Bray is responsible for many things. His company and research have lived on, even through the Dark Age, and all we have more recently faced. However, the man himself had some very startling ideas. Call it confidence or arrogance, Clovis Bray believed that his way of thinking was not only important, but the only way humanity should conduct itself. So much so that Bray was aiming for immortality at any cost. He genetically manipulated his son, Clovis II, and in trying to perfect the exo-mind, destroyed Clovis Jr.'s body by copying his mind on a quantum level. Disturbingly obsessed, Bray did not stop there, and the story continues, darkly. Clovis Bray went to Europa for answers. No, for clarity. Chasing immortality and the results of the K1 artifact from the moon, the Golden Age scientist pursued his goals of keeping himself and those like him alive in perpetuity, believing that his way of thinking was the only way of thinking, and that he was to be humanity's example. Clovis Bray pursued his goals without hesitation and at any cost. Entry 3 begins with Clovis's death. No, not a device of literature, but a fact. Clovis Bray suffered an autonomic nervous system failure and had died for 11 hours while on Europa. Clovis was dying and was using a significant amount of resources and technology to keep himself alive. While he was being revived, Bray had a dream. In the dream, Bray was in the body of an Exo, but he could not remember his previous life. He saw his granddaughter, Anastasia Bray, but at the time he did not recognize her. Upon revival, Bray believed this to be a sign, a communication from clarity, the force of nature, the higher power. He pursued, and he carried on with even more enthusiasm. From the experiments with the K1 artifact on the moon, Clovis Bray had discovered an effect he called clarity. In typical physics, there exists a relationship between cause and effect, and between matter and energy. You may know these ideas by many names. One of the most common is the conservation of energy and matter. Typically, all matter and energy exist with a symmetry, in that if it is physically possible to transform matter from one state to another, then it is possible to go back again. In the example Bray cites, if A can become B, say if water and sugar can mix to become a mixed drink, then it is possible for B to become A. It may be challenging in some cases, but it is possible. However, clarity, Bray speculated, violated Noether's theorem, this symmetry, such that if A becomes B through the clarity effect, then reversing B does not lead back to A, but rather C, something different. Clovis Bray believed that clarity was related to his search for the alkahest, the universal solvent. Originally a term used by alchemists in pursuit of transforming any material into gold, Bray applied the term to the missing ingredient, which would make exomind transfusion possible. At the time of this entry, Exos were barely more than sophisticated AIs, and trying to transfer a living mind into an exo body was left with disaster. Furthermore, Clovis Bray believed that entropy was driven by clarity. If the universe began with perfect order, and has since been becoming more diverse, breaking down and combining in different ways, unable to return to its original state by the force of entropy, this could be caused and linked to the clarity effect. Bray postulated that clarity was actually responsible for everything in the universe as we know it, because if clarity causes entropy, then clarity caused the first dense plasma of the universe to transform into complex structures, from atoms to molecules to nucleotides to life. This, by the way, was not the first time we have heard something like this. In the journals of Toland the Shattered, previously a member of Eris Morn's fire team, specifically the entry Ghost Fragment Darkness 3, Toland states, "Why does anything exist? Why do we have atoms? Because atoms are more stable than the primordial broth. Atoms defeated the broth. That was the first war. Atoms made stars, stars made galaxies. There were two ways to be and one of them won, and everything that came next was made of atoms." Here, Toland describes the natural evolution of the universe, driven by the physical process of entropy, of the complexification of the universe, as something potentially following the sword logic, the pursuit of the final shape of existence most closely associated with the darkness. And we heard this one more time, more recently. During the events of Shadowkeep, as Eris Morn worked to decipher the transmissions sent to the seed we found in the lunar pyramid, one entry in particular also spoke of entropy. In the lore page, The Cambrian Explosion, in the Book of Unveiling, the narrator of the messages, presumably the darkness itself, states, "But did you know that I created you? Your mind and your body and every thought you've ever had. I made you. Not the gardener, but I." The entry goes on to claim that early life was calm, barely existing, barely functioning, but as life discovered new ways of metabolizing and more complicated ways in which to protect itself and move, it began to evolve. The darkness continued by saying, "This was the Cambrian explosion, the great birth of complex life on your world. I caused it. I, the defector, the destroyer, the one who takes." Do you believe it, Guardians? Can you accept it? Can you, for one moment, believe that the entire universe and life itself evolved thanks to the darkness? It is a rather shocking stance, one which drove so-claimed heretics like Toland and Ulantan away from the last city, and is a terrible thought to preserve. Most of city doctrine and understanding rests on the idea that the light and traveler are good, and the darkness is bad. Ulantan believed that darkness and light were necessarily joined, two sides of the same coin, interestingly enough in a philosophy he called the symmetry. However, while the pyramids and presumably the darkness have been reaching out to Guardians for quite some time, it is one thing to believe that power may be amoral, as in having no basic foundation of good or evil, and another thing entirely to believe that the darkness is good. Darkness may have been necessary, but was it good? Hard to say. Clovis Bray believed it, and furthermore, he pursued it. The final portion of the entry details messages drafted, but mostly unsent, to Clovis's granddaughters, Wilhelmina, otherwise known as Willa, Anastasia, aka Anna, and Elizabeth Bray, otherwise known as Elsie, and perhaps better later known as the Exos Stranger. Each of the letters contained some backstory and personal information on the granddaughters, but were also requests. Clovis wanted his granddaughters to help him, but in the end, he only chose to contact Elizabeth. Clovis Bray, following the results of studying the K1 artifact on the moon, pursued an effect known as clarity, an effect which could transform matter universally, which he believed would be the secret to making Exos work. Language and philosophy, similar to how we've seen others discuss the darkness, suggests that the darkness, clarity, and entropy are all related, and that the development of our universe, our very own creation, was all due to the mechanisms of the darkness itself. In Entry 4, after establishing his research station, and even dying once, Clovis Bray finally found her. Clarity control is what he called it, the mystery he was promised. Surrounded in sterile neutrinos and the charged energy density associated with the expansion of the early universe, Bray found something. He described it as having a form, a face, similar to the precursor on Earth's moon. As he continued, in an almost rambling capacity, in a rather ridiculous form of misogyny, I might add, it seems that what Bray encountered matches what we have seen in the pyramid on Luna. A statue of a figure, veiled, and at its base a seed, an artifact. We know that these artifacts apparently provide a line of communication with the darkness, and it would seem that these seeds are somewhat common as the pyramids in any case, as Osiris also found one in deep space prior to the season of arrivals. Curiously, while the energy readings seem to match with those from the early universe, the surrounding ice suggested that this clarity control arrived on Europa no more than 20 years prior to Clovis's arrival. Even Bray himself posed the question as to why. Why now? And why here? In Entry 5, one of the first things Bray attempts to do is move clarity control, and it does not go well. 19 casualties, engineers from the team, were caught in a violent reaction, Yet Bray continued to believe that Clarity Control was not malevolent. In fact, he believed that Clarity Control was whispering to him, calling him, ushering him closer to his goal of achieving immortality. While much of the logs show a man descending into what would justifiably deem madness, it is interesting to see that some scientific caution did remain. Bray decided to put an orbital platform over the Europa site, in case there was a need for catastrophic containment, or at least a thorough reduction of the station. This explains what we saw earlier in the Europa Report to the Vanguard, the orbital platform that seemed highly capable of defending itself, but also somewhat partial to Eon series jump ships. The Eon series of jump ships and Sparrows was originally designed by Elizabeth, or Elsie, Bray, and as one of his own grandchildren, it makes sense that Bray would design his defense platform to show some leniency toward her work, in case she ever decided to visit. Which she eventually did. Under both threat of exposure and in an effort to limit the damage Clovis could cause, Elizabeth decided to join him on Europa. Each member of the Bray family has an extensive history, but the short version is that Elizabeth Bray was sick. They all were. In an effort to maintain himself as the Luca, the last universal common ancestor, essentially the source and leader of all society, human society and thought, Clovis Bray experimented on his children and his grandchildren. Neurological and physiological challenges were rampant in the family, but somewhat contained and controlled through advanced medical technology and research. Bray called this the Clovis Curse. After stripping his own son's mitochondrial DNA, Clovis II fell gravely ill. He suffered, and Bray's advanced medical technology could not help. In fact, it was part of the problem. Bray had engineered his son to have a hyper-vigilant immune system, which made gene therapy ineffective. And so, Bray turned to exoscience. However, the process was still relatively new, poorly designed, and so Clovis Jr.'s mind refused the exo body and tried to tear itself apart. Bray performed a quantum snapshot scan of his son, preserving the mind until the process was perfected, and was hoping to do the same for both himself and his other grandchildren. At this point in time, exos were not as they are today. Rather than sentient beings housed in a mechanical frame, exos were advanced AI. Bray had been trying for quite some time to perfect the process of transferring a human consciousness into an exo body, with disastrous results. First, there was the issue of billboarding. If the process of duplication and transfer of a human mind was too simple, if it missed the nuance of a person, then the result would be a flat imitation, a limited version of the person, a billboard, so to speak. Similar to pre-Golden Age Turing tests, there were ways to test the humanity of these copies, disrespectfully deemed a zombie detector. However, exominds quickly failed the zombie test. Their behavior would become repetitive, simple, looping over and over, and the mind and structure of these loops would devolve from complex social interaction to basic motor function, like constant pacing, chewing, and hurting oneself. Eventually, the exo would tear itself apart, body and mind thrashing until nothing was left. Bray recalled several horrifying episodes, such as once having what he felt was a deeply emotional conversation with a woman, only to realize she was simply a billboard, a dead person looping a particular behavior. At first, Bray thought the problem was caused by a brain not getting enough proper stimuli, like a tiger bored in its cage. Later, Bray postulated that the mind is constantly self-correcting, always updating and evolving. Clovis believed this was a necessary process driven by chaotic environments and evolution. The mind was constantly checking against cosmic rays, chemical imbalances, electromagnetic fields, emotions and logic, and new stimuli. But since the exomind process created a perfect, unchanging virtual copy, the exomind was not able to self-correct or change, and it simply tried and tried until it broke down. Think about the last challenging Nightfall strike you tried to take on for Zavala, or the last time you engaged in high-level trials or the Crucible. If faced with a significant challenge that yields no progress, if you do not take a step back to change and learn and grow, you'll just punish yourself too hard and push, wearing yourself out. But in this case, quite literally. Therefore, Clovis Bray theorized that the exo mind was not messy enough, or as he put it, without countervailing entropy, the very self-corrective processes meant to maintain the human mind calcify and kill it. Bray believed he needed a useful source of noise introduced to the system, and he believed the best way was with clarity. This is what drove Clovis Bray to Europa. On a surface level, even believed by him, in part, Clovis was pursuing immortality to save his family. However, his true goal was to not only live forever, but be the guiding mind behind humanity. To achieve this, Bray thought he needed to live on, immortal, but also unchanging, and make everyone like him. Clovis Bray was undoubtedly a genius, but his intelligence made him arrogant, made him feel important and better than everyone else. His verbose philosophy, the primogeniture of future history ontogeny riphonology, basically boiled down to, I am right, and I have a responsibility to ensure that my ideas are the only ideas, by making everyone and everything else more like me. It's interesting, now that I'm transcribing this log, to see the parallels here between Clovis's philosophy and that of the Hive. The sword logic, and arguably the darkness's pursuit of the final shape, follow a similar line of thinking. Essentially, if something survives, it deserves to do so. Its strength merits its survival over the defeated. And if something is strong enough, it will continue to survive until nothing else is left except that thing. Furthermore, if something is strong, these philosophies dictate that it actually has the right to dominate, to survive and succeed over the rest. All three approaches assume the same thing, that letting anything that is deemed unworthy or weak to continue and survive only limits true progress and potential. And that is where we will stop for now. Clovis Bray's quest for immortality and for instilling himself as the leader of all human thought drove him to developing exoscience and following the darkness from the moon to Europa. Exominds were quite limited at this point, and it is interesting to see the development of this technology, but also the challenges which have long plagued it. Clovis Bray was a man who not only believed he was absolutely right, but that it was a moral imperative for him to keep going, no matter what dark secrets he uncovered. And trust me, darkness is coming. Mystery. Our universe is full of it. Even when you believe you have scouted every location, every cave and lost sector, the universe will surprise you. Quietly orbiting Jupiter, seemingly ignored by most guardians, Europa seems like the last place to unfold a deeper mystery. But rumors have begun stirring, whispers of long-lost research, Golden Age technology, and unseen danger residing on its cold surface. Clovis Bray was in contact, communicating with Clarity Control. Apparently, it instructed him to make a gate. Bray believed this followed naturally from the messenger hypothesis. Seeking the most efficient way of interstellar contact, aliens would likely find it easier to send instructions for a message receiver or possibly a portal. The design, however, appeared to be Vex in nature. Surmising that the easiest way to make a Vex gate was to have a Vex do it, Bray decided to plan a raid. For some time, as dictated in earlier entries, Clovis Bray was trying to learn some of the secrets uncovered by the Ishtar Collective. The Collective, another research organization during the Golden Age, had been making great success at understanding the Vex. Apparently, They were even able to create simulations of their researchers to better understand the Vex method of simulating and experimenting entire worlds and scenarios. Bray had tried hacking their databases, even tried poaching their staff, but in the end, he decided to use their own information against them. In what Bray called an outbreak, where he forced the Ishtar Collective's artifacts to exhibit, quote, expand and exploit behavior, where Rasputin intervened with frames and orbital fire, Clovis Bray was able to steal a Vex at the cost of some lives. The Vex began its work immediately, following the design and using simple materials. Bray theorized that this was because the design was old, calling for the use of lighter elements before heavy elements were formed in the universe. Not too long in the process, Clovis Bray almost died again. While defibrillating, he had a dream, or possibly a vision. A truly bizarre entry, possibly allegorical. Clovis Bray dreamt that he was a salamander, crawling on its belly. He saw animals by the water and realized he could join separate pools of water together. As he continued to do so, Bray realized he could begin controlling other creatures through their need for resources. Those who chose to follow him were rewarded. Those who didn't were beset upon by his allies. This process continued until Bray was more than a salamander. He was a controller of resources, then a controller of controllers. Finally, he met a giant wave who he felt was God, who said, "You are like me, join me." And as he did so, the wave wiped out all lower life forms. Clovis Bray believed it to be a message from Clarity Control, from the darkness, but even still, it is a challenging message to decipher. The darkness has long eluded our understanding, and even though it appears to have been speaking with us more directly quite recently, it is still a very different entity. It is often very challenging to understand its motives or its perspective. In the miasma, the nebulous cloud of possibility of what the darkness is and what it wants, any definition, perspective, or understanding we try to impart is like a small box trying to hold a cloud. What strikes me as interesting is that while it allegedly was a dream from the darkness, it almost sounds something like the gardener would endorse. Bringing species and resources together, growing stronger through collective effort, this sounds different from the winnowing, final shape, philosophy we have heard so far from the darkness. In Entry 7, Clovis and his team passed through the gate. Bray, his granddaughter Elizabeth, several scientists, and Maya Sundaresh, formerly from the Ishtar Collective, went through the gate to another 4-point in our space-time, as Bray described it, a place far away, or possibly in a parallel universe. The terrain was rocky, and the sky completely filled with the light of a blue hypergiant, Type O star. When I say hypergiant, I mean it. The size of such a star was large enough to fill the space between our sun and Neptune, whose light and heat should have vaporized the team, yet there they stood, unharmed. The environment was even, impossibly, safe for life. The team explored nearby ancient stone ruins, pierced with metal towers and flickering lines of light. The team's geologist examined the composition and found that there were no heavy elements present. Sodium, oxygen, boron, yes, aluminum even, but very little silicon. Even more impressive, the rock appeared to be 13 billion years old, having formed at the very earliest stage of the universe. Stranger still, the astronomer pointed out that a Type O star like this barely lives longer than 2 million years. They burn hot and bright for a comparatively short period of time. Looking closer, the team discovered clusters of orbiting craft and rings of particle accelerators encircling the star. The craft were moving interstellar material, and more than that, they were refueling the star. Faced with the possibility of their star burning out, someone, something, had created a star forge, a fusion smelter, keeping the star alive and building heavier materials necessary for more complex machinery. Examining the terrain further, the team found an island of living glass, fissures of deep green light, and reservoirs of white fluid. Off in the distance, lightning flashed, reminding Clovis of the Citadel ruins on Venus. There, through a Vex gate to a distant world, standing on terrain as old as the universe, under a solar system-sized hypergiant star forge, Clovis felt disappointed. He was looking for an answer, a way to achieve immortality, and while everything here in this faraway world was impressive, he was expecting a warmer and more direct welcome. He had followed the signs, he had worked hard and sacrificed, and he really did not have a lot of time left. Gathering his wits, Bray instructed his team to collect some samples and return. Of course, for those thinking ahead, that fluid that they discovered was none other than Vex radiolaria. Also known as Vex mind fluid or Vex milk, Clovis and his team began experimenting on it. Some information, brought to the team by Maya Sundaresh, warned of toxicity and physical infection by Vex fluid, but Bray's team found possibly even more disturbing effects. The first was transformation. Exposure to Vex milk could restructure organic material and even technology to suit the Vex. Consider Asher Mir, whose fire team was trapped in the Pyramidion for some time, leaving the Jensum scribe infected with a Vex arm. Perhaps a more disturbing effect of Vex milk was the transfusion of, quote, viral semiotic signifiers. Simply put, Vex will rewire your brain. If you try to think of, say, an apple, the network of thought will be redirected to something Vex-like, such as gauge, contrast, gouge. No matter how hard you try to think of an apple, you'll arrive at the Vex response instead. In light of the dangers, Clovis Bray enacted several protocols, specifically Solcescent, Wildfire, Hex-Tempered, and Brainstain. Digging through the annals of the Ishtar Collective, I have identified Solcescent as a Rasputin submind protocol for monitoring the solar system and handling threats. I could not find a reference to Wildfire or Hex-Tempered at this time, but if anyone has one, please let me know. Brainstain was referenced in regards to both the Dreadnought and the Truth to Power lore book. In the lore page Thetis Brave, someone had believed they were put in the wrong virtual machine, a simulated prison. The reference to the Dreadnought was a communique from Awoken Petra Venge during the Taken War, warning fleets to not run a teleonomic analysis of the Dreadnought emissions. Looking closer, teleonomy is the study of an organism's purpose, such as the purpose of RNA or the mitochondria. I believe, therefore, that combining this with the mind alteration evidenced by the Vex, that a too close examination of the purpose of Vex fluid, or other infections of this type, could cause the brain to be corrupted, taken over, rewired. Entry 8. Eureka. Experiments with Vex fluid found that while it was too infectious and virulent for exominds, when it was exposed to clarity, the Vex fluid would break down, but retain clarity's reductive effect. As such, Vex milk could be passed through clarity control, broken down, but carry the effect of clarity elsewhere. In essence, Vex milk could carry the effect of the darkness elsewhere. Passing a tiny sample of this into an exomind seemed to solve the earlier loop billboard crash cycle, the breakdown of exominds mentioned earlier. An exomind, a perfect copy of a human brain with the same necessity to constantly self-correct, normally found the copy to be too perfect and would break down, wear itself out and tear itself apart like sharpening a pencil to bits. But the clarity-infused Vex fluid acted as a random noise generator in the exomind, giving it something else to focus on, correct, and prevented the Exo from driving itself insane. Clovis Bray had seemingly done it. Searching for immortality, faced with the problem of early Exo minds tearing themselves apart, Bray had traveled to Europa, chasing whispers from the darkness. There, he stole a Vex, used it to make a gate, transported to what could very well be the Vex homeworld, stole their fluid, and infused darkness-filled Vex fluid into Exos, making a stable Exo mind. If it weren't incredibly horrible, it would be very impressive. A remarkable feat of science. Bray commenced production immediately, using scanned copies of personnel on file, making working Exos. In early days, alchemists believed that the source of the alkahest, the universal solvent, was the Philosopher's Stone. However, Clovis Bray chose to name the distant land that place with the deepest, oldest stone, the place where the dead go to rise again. Clovis Bray called it the Deep Stone Crypt. However, any celebration Bray could have would be very short-lived. While clarity-infused radiolaria seemed to solve the crashing problem, a new problem arose. DER. Dissociative Exomind Rejection. Those of you who have studied the Exo program more recently may be familiar with DER. Essentially, it means that a human mind, after a time, begins to reject being in a synthetic body. If left too long, the mind will try to break free, causing a traumatic and eventually fatal condition known as DER. To counteract this, Exos have been programmed to continue to mimic and necessitate organic behavior. For example, while an Exo theoretically doesn't have to eat or sleep, an organic person does. To keep the Exo mind from tearing itself away from its mechanical body, like an antibody fighting its own cells, Exos are made to believe that eating and sleeping are still necessary. And in fact, they are. An Exo may not have to technically consume food, nutrients to survive, but without doing so, would have a mental breakdown and die. Ipso facto, Exos need to do many of the same things organic beings do. The final portion of the final entry is quite disturbing, and to serve as a warning, I chose to read it in its entirety. Warning: novel prion detected in body collagen. Hypothesis: Jovian magnetosphere promotes highly abnormal protein folding. Prognosis: massive sloughing, fraying of basement membranes, loss of tissue binding, inhibited durotaxis of new cells, delamination of all body tissues into thin sheets. You will fall apart like an old book. In the end, Clovis Bray's story is a descent into madness, driven by the arrogant idea that his ideas were the only ones worth following or preserving. Clovis experimented on his children and grandchildren. He pursued advanced biological practices and medicines to keep himself alive and unwavering. When he reached the limits of biology, he turned to exoscience, chasing the whispers of darkness first found on the moon, under the lunar pyramid. Clovis made his way to Europa. There, he constructed a research station and a Vex gate. His team traveled to another point in space, possibly another dimension, found universe-old infrastructure, a star forge as large as our solar system, and more Vex. Bray realized that he could infuse Vex fluid with darkness, clarity as he called it, and it would carry on the transformative effect into an Exo, solving it from crashing, allowing for the upload and preservation of a full human consciousness. However, despite all of his efforts, all of his science, and his belief in what he was doing, despite all of his sacrifices and sacrilege, Clovis Bray ultimately failed. Exos are not immortal. With one problem solved, a new one arose, and Exos still find themselves having to reset their lives, their memories, to physically survive. Bray's legacy cannot, will not, and did not live on unchanged. What we have learned here is quite shocking. If these entries are to be believed, Clovis Bray, the man behind many of humanity's technological marvels, was only able to create viable exos through an infusion of Vex fluid and the darkness. If true, it may explain why many exos dream of a cold, desolate world, empty, yet full of death, with a foreboding tower in the distance. It would mean that every exo you encounter is equal parts Vex, darkness, as well as Braytech. While philosophers like Ulan Tan would preach the symmetry, the inherent balance of light and dark, the necessity of one for the existence of the other, it is a chilling thought to imagine that all of our exo friends contain mind-altering Vex fluid and the power of the darkness. This is as far as the deciphered logs go. In fact, the last few pages are torn. I do not know why the stranger has returned. I do not know why she entrusted me specifically with these entries. But perhaps it was because she knew that I would pass them on to you. If rumors are true, and Guardians may find themselves touching down on that cold, Jovian moon, we need to go fully armed. Not just with weapons, not just with the light, but beyond, with knowledge, wisdom, and caution. I hope that you have found this series helpful, and that it helps prepare you for what's to come. We all have to make our own decisions, so I will leave that to you. I hope this not to be my final transmission, but the future is the undiscovered country, the unknown. So who knows when our paths may cross again. As always, Guardians, I ask that you be safe, be kind, and be brave. Kaz PhD, signing off.